Heart of the Machine is a new, ambitious game early in development at this point, generally in the strategy and simulation space. Keep in mind, everything we're going to show and talk about here could potentially change. One area of emphasis is to make it as easy as possible for players to get into a game quickly that has a level of challenge they're looking for. At the start, you pick one of 3 paths, and I think this is really heavily inspired by the RimWorld storytellers, if you're familiar with those. You select either sandbox, balanced, or a more strategic approach. Pick one of those 3 options, and immediately you're into a new game. Those aren't the only difficulty or challenge-related options that you're going to pick, but it's the only one you need to pick at the start. The idea is that you don't have a big raft of questions that you've got to answer right away, even before you know what they mean, or if you do, not really sure how they're all going to interact. Then you go into the game, you start playing, and you realize this is too hard, or this is too easy, or this is not what I wanted. To fix it, you've got to go back out, start a new game, and answer a whole another list of questions again, and fix whatever you want for your settings. So just the one minimal choice up front, and then the rest is just punted off down the road until you have a better handle on exactly what you want to do. As you progress through the early game, you have choices on what they are calling Luminance. Luminance is more than just difficulty, but it definitely includes that. It'll ask if you want it lighter or darker or keep it about the same. And so you're tweaking your experience, your difficulty level as you play through, and that gives you a much better chance of getting the experience you want. The final element of this is what goals or victory conditions are you going to aim for, if any. If you want a more casual sandboxy approach, just take the sandbox option initially, keep hitting light on the world luminance, and don't go for any of the more difficult victory conditions. If you want it to be really super hard, take the best shot the game has to offer. You'll hit the strategic option first, keep hitting dark on the luminance every time it comes up, and then also really go for some of the harder victory conditions, or maybe even a compound approach where you're trying to hit multiple victory conditions in one run. Of course, it's expected that most players will settle somewhere in between those 2 extremes, but you're customizing your own experience in terms of the challenge as you play through the game. The most pithy way I know to describe what Heart of the Machine is trying to be is to call it an asymmetrical, reverse Citybuilder Skynet Simulator. If you're anything like me, your first reaction is, I'm sorry, a what? Those were definitely words you just said, but what does that mean? The most important bit to unpack is reverse Citybuilder. Think for a moment about how a traditional city builder, such as SimCity or City Skylines, works. You have a very high-level perspective and a very high level of control. You're the architect or the engineer of the city. You say where people live, where they work, where they shop. You make sure all the essential needs are met in terms of infrastructure, transportation system, electrical system, water system, police and fire protection. Learn to manage all those elements well enough to make a profit. People move in, your city grows and flourishes, and you can do whatever you'd like with it. In Heart of the Machine, you don't start with a big landscape and build a city there. You're dropped into a large, sprawling city that already exists. I'll examine the setting in more detail later, but this is future dystopian Earth, and there are many factions vying for control in the city. Competition is intense, and they dynamically react to the decisions you make. The most prominent of these factions are large, powerful corporations. Governments as we would recognize them today are a forgotten, abandoned relic of the distant past. Direct commerce, buying and selling assets, businesses, and so on might remind you some of tycoon games such as capitalism. There's a lot more going on here. Bribery is a thing. Corruption is a thing. Using your political influence to get the job done if you don't want to spend your money or you can't get what you need done that way. There's also simply direct force. I want this, I'm taking it. There's tactical turn-based combat. If combat isn't your thing, you can hire that out. There's paramilitary groups and defense contractors all over the place. There are other what you might call minor factions with their various interests as well. There are mining companies. There are religious organizations of various sizes. There are factions that run public utilities, water purification, sewage, fire protection, story elements involving specific people in the city. You need to deal with pollution. Random events can change things up. So it's a large, diverse world, all kinds of dynamics going on, and typically when you run into a problem, there's going to be many different ways in which you can solve it. Which leads us to the question of, why do you care? What's your role in this city? What are you trying to do as a player? Going back to our initial description of Heart of the Machine, now we want to look at the asymmetric Skynet Simulator concept. What is the Heart of the Machine? You. You are the heart of the machine. You are a sentient AI. You begin a game with a modest startup fund and a couple of shell corporations. But as an AI, some of your abilities are the same as the human corporations you're going to be opposing, but many of them are different. A couple of quick blurbs they've put on Steam just so you can get the idea. Turn the office printer into a laser-spewing pawn. Commandeer giant mechs. Raid enemy facilities. Transform TVs into exploding glass shard grenades. And as an AI, it's also intended that you'll have clandestine, covert abilities that are beyond what a human corporation would have. A lot of the emphasis is you're taking what humans have built, and when it suits your purposes, you're using it against them, often in ways it was not intended to be used. This is where the concept of urban wilderness really comes into play. The humans in the city, and on a larger level, the various corporations and other factions, really fill the role that in other games might be filled by wildlife, or trees, or forests, or swamps, or mountains, or whatever. They can be valuable resources, they can be obstacles, they can be enemies, depending on how you interact with them. In the big picture, what's your goal? How do you win? You might want to try to fix some of the problems and injustices in the city. Make it a better place for people to live. Maybe you don't care about that and you just want to blow the whole thing up. Nuclear weapons exist. You can say, I'm out of here. I'm leaving these humans to solve their own problems and use the space program to literally leave the planet. To my knowledge, the most difficult goal to achieve right now is to literally take over the political power structure of the city and become the machine overlord. Run the show yourself. That's not an exhaustive list. It's intended that you have a lot of different victory conditions. You might want to go for multiple of them in one run, or maybe you're aiming for one and things sort of go against you, so you readjust and go for something different. All of those types of possibilities are there. That's my overview of Heart of the Machine. Thank you for sticking with me so far. And now we've basically reached the red pill, blue pill moment. Ask yourself if this interests you, if this is something you want to learn more about, or if it's, nah, that's too different, or that's not for me, I'll stick with the games I already have. For those who do want more, let's dive a little bit into the details on those areas where it is publicly known. Or as Morpheus might say, let's see how deep the rabbit hole goes. Any good story requires a compelling setting. Heart of the Machine takes place at a time when humanity has been colonizing space for a few hundred years. Hundreds of colonies have been established, each of them governing their own affairs as they see fit. For anyone familiar with or interested in the rest of the Arkanverse, this is very roughly about 1,000 years before the human galactic civil war, which would eventually result in the events of the AI war games. Relative to all of that, there isn't that much going on in our solar system anymore. There are some mining operations still going on near Earth and also further out into the system, but Earth itself is an embarrassing backwater of a planet and one that is not improving. Most of the natural resources have been exhausted, climate change has had some major effects including a significant rise in ocean levels, and the people who are left on Earth, they make their living by strip mining what few resources remain. Anyone with the wealth or connections to leave Earth for a better life in the colonies did that at least a century ago. Earth is divided at this time into 12 zones, each of which is administered by a corporation. These don't have any sort of official name, but for the purposes of this video and identifying the different levels of scale, I'm going to refer to these as zonal corps. Bionic Dews and Release Raptor each take place in different zones, but the zone we're concerned with includes Siberia. The changes in Earth's climate have actually made Siberia the best place to live. Siberia now has a temperate climate, and there are many natural resources still left here to be exploited. The other cities still remaining on Earth are not doing nearly as well, to varying degrees. That brings us to the city level, which is the scope of the game world we're involved in as a player. There's very limited interaction outside of the city. Improving technology can be done by selling resources to whomever off-map in orbit. There may or may not be limited trading interaction with other Earth cities, but again, they're not that interesting compared to the one we're in. I know people will ask, how big are these cities anyway? The size they are balancing around right now is about 2 million people, maybe a little bit less, somewhere around 27,000 buildings in a city. So this isn't the blink and you miss it village you run into driving along the state highway. Another way of getting a sense of the scale is to look a little more closely at this picture. Farms such as these will be scattered throughout the city. The cities are designed to be entirely self-sufficient, so they're not importing anything from the countryside. This farm occupies one tile of the city, and there are 475 tiles in an average city. You can see more tiles in the surrounding area, but everything you can see in one shot is only a very, very small fraction of the whole city. Within the city, the most powerful tier of factions are the 16 major corporations. There's a much larger number of minor corporations of different types, and they can and will be bought, sold, traded around by the majors. But the 16 majors are the visible power structure, if you will. They have tendencies of sorts, each will tend to specialize in different areas and be weaker in others, but there will also be significant variance in between cities. Essentially a middle ground there between totally random chaos and everything's always the same. The numbers that are out there right now is that there's about 50 minor corporations. On top of that, there's maybe 12 or so of what they're calling indie miners, basically a chain of mom and pop type businesses. You've got the civil service corporations, which are running some sort of public utility or similar service. The religious groups, as I mentioned. The mining companies, so there's a hodgepodge of various interests going on. I would describe the general environment of the city as loosely controlled chaos. In many strategy games such as Stellaris, Crusader Kings, etc., you've got this explicit war and peace mechanic going on. And everybody's got their own territory, and that's contiguous, and then next to them is some other kingdom or some other empire with their own territory. Heart of the Machine is much more chaotic. Most factions are expecting to be frenemies with other factions. They might be working together really closely on one goal in one area or one sector of the economy, and at the same time they're fighting each other tooth and nail in some other area. Everybody's out for themselves, but at the same time nobody is self-sufficient, so they have to depend on others. And again, limited physical combat is just an expectation. It's part of the cost of doing business. Depending on how the game unfolds, you may have a cluster of a bunch of your interests right next to each other, or you might have scattered assets throughout the city, each one surrounded by rival corporations. Extra caveat here, the UI is not expected to look like this at all when it's finished, but we can see, aside from the physical buildings and corporations, some of the elements that are going to be competed over. In this image, we can see a couple of interesting things. One is the basement levels. Sensitive projects happening far underground where they're much more difficult to attack. There's also several different types of labor listed there. Corporations competing with each other for the amount of the type of labor that they need to handle their business, or perhaps changing what businesses they're going to focus on operating to have a better handle on having the type of labor they need for that. Here we have a barn, and we've got several different types of resources stored there. It's not abstracted to the point of, okay, here's a building and it just operates and does its thing. There's a complex, dynamic economic model of needing to have the right resources in the right place, and can you acquire all those resources at a reasonable price? If somebody's trying to corner the market on a specific type of resource, what do you do about that before the price gets driven too high? Returning to the idea of loosely controlled chaos, you might be wondering, as I did, how is this kept in balance? What's stopping a corporation with an advantage in the military in some way from just wiping out everybody else? The city is managed as a poorly run autocracy, but that's only partly due to incompetence. A lot of it is purposeful. It's not really profitable to run it well. The people of Earth are not complete idiots. They can see the general trend. The future of this planet is not good, and they're stuck here, and there's nothing they can do about it. That breeds a lot of hopelessness, discontent, unrest. We need to return to the big zonal corp that we mentioned, administrating the entire zone, including this city. Their presence is very shadowy and secretive. It's not really considered safe to discuss them openly. But it's also clear that even the 16 major corporations, they have lines they won't cross because it's very unsafe to do so, and the zonal corp would smack them down if they did. It's not explicit, though, like a king or other dictator laying out their decrees and, this is illegal and this is not illegal. The average person is never sure what those lines are. There are a couple features I haven't mentioned yet: movements and diseases. Diseases are what you might expect, a pandemic of some sort sweeping through the city, causing all kinds of carnage and death. Movements are ideological, but it's a similar concept: the rise and fall of social opinion in different directions. So if a new disease comes up, or if some major corporations are backing a particular movement, why are they doing that? Person on the street's not going to know. Is it something the Zonal Corp had direct influence in? Is it something that major corporation is doing because they think it's going to further their interests or weaken the interests of one of their competitors? The political life, if you will, of the city is uncertain, and it's always shifting, and you're never sure who is really behind this action. So if you're an activist or a terrorist, what do you even fight against? Tough to fight an enemy you can't see. So a certain level of dysfunction, injustice, violence in the city is actually desired from the perspective of the Zonal Corp, but they just want to keep it within certain boundaries so it's not interfering with their bottom line. It's a tax write-off. It's a overhead. One phrase that's been used to describe this is corporatist neo-feudalism. For the average person, by far the safest path is simply keep your head down and don't cause a ruckus. The more valuable you are to a powerful corporation, the better off you're going to be. The cost of having you arrested on some trumped up charge, it's much better if you're doing something that's highly valuable, whether you're actually a person or a corporation. Many of the gameplay details in Heart of the Machine, such as how exactly the turn-based tactical combat is going to work, are still being worked on and not available yet for me to show. People are always interested in knowing the release date. All that's out there right now is sometime in 2023. Closed alpha testing is expected before the end of the year, sometime early next year, some sort of demo, but we can't get specific beyond that. Aside from the various commodity-type resources that are traded back and forth, there are two primary resources that you'll use to spend. One is just money, buying something. The other one is influence. Those are both currency types. Spend money or influence, and it's subtracted from what you have. There's an opinion meter defining what each faction thinks of each other faction. Player starts with 2 shell corporations. It's likely you can acquire more later. And your shell corporations don't have to be pointing in the same direction. In other words, one shell corporation can have completely different relationships with the rest of the city as your other shell corporation does if you're trying to diversify. I also think it's worth mentioning the general approach that they're taking in terms of how much abstraction versus how much micromanagement is going to be involved. A big example that keeps coming up here is traffic. Modeling traffic has been done in so many city builders, and it was going to be present here at one point as well, but they came to the conclusion that it was really just going to slow down the sim, and there weren't interesting decisions revolving around it since you're not actually the architect of the city. So from one point of view, you could say, really? You're doing a city simulation without a detailed model of traffic? On the other hand, there's that focus on trying to make sure that the features that are modeled and presented are the ones that are essential and interesting to interact with for the player. And then whatever's outside of that is superfluous and it's just fluff that's torn out so it doesn't slow down or compromise the experience. Multiplayer is always a common question. That is not a planned feature. There will be modding support that'll be done via XML on the data side, and for the generated cities, they've described it as a layer cake approach, where some elements are procedurally generated and others are handcrafted assets. I don't know exactly which elements fit in each category, but it will be possible to do things like make a different type of building, or a different type of tree, or a different type of flower, or whatever, and then not have to design a whole city or a whole tile area, but just plug that one asset in and have that included in the generated cities. My overall impression of Heart of the Machine at this stage is one of cautious enthusiasm. I would say the best part about it, and also the biggest challenge, are one and the same: how different it is from anything else that's out there. This is not a derivative clone. Concepts are borrowed from many different genres without copying any one of them. Having city builder elements combined with tycoon type of elements, combined with also having turn-based combat, the sort of unique, ambiguous moral element in terms of how do we interact with these humans? Do we help them? Do we abuse them for our own purposes? Do we just keep some around for appearances so it's not as obvious that we're an advanced machine intelligence? A dynamic world being simulated with its own emergent story from each playthrough, different types of objectives to aim for, or aim for none of them at all and treat it as a sandbox. I think that's a very rich and potentially fantastic canvas to paint this on. At the same time, it will inevitably confuse a certain number of players, and some people are just going to bounce off, which is why I think the whole non-traditional approach to difficulty they're taking is really important. Probably the best chance Arkan has of keeping a lot more people interested in the game after they first try it, and not making them feel like they're going to have to do a whole bunch of work to get their heads around this, and who knows if they'll even enjoy it after they do that. The other primary concerns I have are related to scope. The natural inertia towards feature creep and making a game bloated, and there are so many possibilities in a game like Heart of the Machine. To keep it manageable at all, you've just got to say no a lot. And I'm encouraged that they are doing that quite a bit. Along with the traffic, there's another feature they mentioned where they were thinking about allowing the player to just get in a plane and fly around, get in a car, drive around the city. And after experimenting with that, they quickly realized this really isn't going to be good, this isn't going to help the game, we're just going to get rid of it. And I hope they really keep that focus. Somewhat related is as they get to the details of, micromanagement versus macromanagement. How much is enough control, enough different features that the player can use, but not so much that it feels like maintenance-style busywork? The fact that Heart of the Machine isn't simply retreading the same beaten path that's been done before actually makes this a lot harder. Because you can look at City Skylines or Crusader Kings or whatever game and just say, okay, this worked for them, this didn't work for them, we're going to learn from what worked, learn from what didn't work, here's our new way. When you're forging your own trail, you're taking the risk. You don't have the luxury of all that experience that others have had working for you. And they are very focused in on this. So I'm not saying Heart of the Machine is bad in that area. I just think that as it gets into testing, they're going to get flooded with ideas. They want to have a large testing team, which is great. What do you say yes to? What do you say no to? What is the mix of features that you end up with? I think those decisions are what's really going to decide whether Heart of the Machine is great and fantastic and defines its whole new genre, becomes a big hit, or whether it's, they really took a good shot at a new idea and, well, they just kind of missed the mark there. One of the most encouraging aspects to me is the fact that they've partnered with publisher Hooded Horse. For those who aren't familiar with them, they're the publisher that's behind Terra Invicta and Old World, among recent indie strategy games. And it's given Arkan's lead developer, Chris McElligott-Park, a team behind him, which is something he didn't really have on AI War 2. Over the last few years, it's been my privilege to get to know him, and I can say in all honesty, he's a brilliant developer, but he's a much better person. The private persona is even better than the one I see in public, and I legit admire him. That's part of why I'm not totally unbiased here, because I really want what he does to succeed. But I can tell the difference with him having a publisher behind him to help with marketing, to help with giving different perspectives. On AI War 2, there were times I'd come up with an idea, and sometimes I would think, well, I'm sure they've already considered that, and it would be a new, fresh perspective that maybe hadn't been looked at too close. Most of the time that wasn't the case, but there were times when it was. And a lot of things just being cobbled together by Chris and maybe one or two other people, a lot of volunteers trying to pitch in, make everything work. In talking to him, answering him questions about Heart of the Machine, and none of this is private stuff on this title. I'm not an insider on this, it's just been asking questions in the public Discord that anybody can ask, anybody can read, but I haven't been able to find anything where they hadn't already considered it and didn't already have an answer prepared. Sometimes it's, oh yeah, we've thought about that, and this is how we're going to handle it. And most of the time it was better than what I was thinking or exactly what I was thinking. And others have been, well, we just haven't gotten to that yet. We're building these foundational mechanics into the game. Sort of that's going to be layered on top of them, so we have to do A before we can do B. Lay the basement before you can have the second floor. But there was nothing that gave me the impression of, well, they haven't really thought about that. Now, I don't agree with them on everything. One example is that for now there aren't any city overview displays. They might add that if enough people are bothered by it, but they're trying to keep you immersed in the city as a place to explore and check out different areas. So while it feels really weird to me to be playing a city builder-ish kind of game without that sort of top-down approach, I also very much understand why they're doing it, and it's not something where there's any lack of due diligence in trying to make sure every angle is covered. That's all I have to say for now about Heart of the Machine. I'd like to hear from all of you in the comments below. What do you like about this idea? What don't you like about it? What questions do you have? Are there any features you're particularly interested in that you'd like me to cover as soon as more information becomes available? Any other feedback you might have, fire it at me, and I appreciate all of you watching.